begin to use bicycling more throughout the city. And for the busing, simple things like, can you get more buses on the routes? Can you increase the time that the buses operate? Can you look at actually adding more routes since they're so successful? So you begin, since you have so many people using it already, begin to try to expand it in well thought out ways. There are deficiencies as well as successes. We looked at those as well. We noted deficiencies in the walking system, we noted deficiencies in the bicycle system, and deficiencies in the bus system. One of the biggest deficiencies I mentioned already is that there's just not enough time and people to really do good planning, long-term planning for some of these modes. There's just not the capacity to do that, and so addressing that issue might be important. In the walking system, there's obviously gaps here and there for the system. It's not a complete system. There are some places that might present dangers. There's some actually high crash locations for pedestrians and motor vehicles, and so we looked specifically at those areas. Bicycling, there's not a lot of facilities yet as far as we can tell, so beginning to try to think of those and ways to expand that might be important. And even though that it's well accepted, there still isn't a lot of bicycling going on in the city, even though the ones we saw were a wide range of different types of people. And again, the busing deficiencies we talked about already as part of your success. But again, trying to be able to do more long-term planning. We look specifically, say, at the bus terminals, or the bus stops. They could be improved. They're not necessarily as inviting to the people that are using them. And there are lots of areas where there's conflicts between the different types of modes. An example of the deficiencies, where this sidewalk just sort of comes to end at a corner. Pedestrians don't really know what's around that corner, and they have to step out into the street, hoping that there's not a car coming around the corner. And there's not lots of these things around, and these things occur in all cities, but they're things that need to be addressed to try to create a complete system. So again, we looked at that. How can we begin to improve things? And I neglected to mention it last time, but I'll talk about it here. We looked at both big, large-scale type of resolutions. We looked at some mid-size recommendations, and then some very detailed recommendations. And that's what that L, the D, or the M stand for in those columns, whether it's a big or small. One of the initial things, the large scale, is begin to try to put together a pedestrian master plan of the whole system. How is this system going to exist, and how are we going to get to that? Same thing for the bicycling system. What type of a large bicycling system can we create as a whole, see what our end point might be, or at least the first end point, and then that helps us plan to get there. And same thing for the bus routes. Right now because there's a lot of use of this, there's some discussion of putting in a light rail system. Would be another excellent addition to the transportation system in the area, as long as it goes through the right areas and as long as it hits the right ends. One of the great things about a bus system is that if it's not working, you can move it, you can shift the routes, you can change the times of the things, you can move things around. With a light rail, you've got to make sure that you put it in the right spot, because it's really hard to move it once it's there. So you need a lot of planning ahead of time to make sure that it's hitting the right location. But it would be a great addition and an expansion of your overall system. But you might want to step back and look at the bus system as well. Can we add more routes? Can we add more buses? Can we change the time? Things like that. Some of the examples of this might be looking for the bicycles. Where are the points of places where bicyclists might want to go? The university campuses. Say if you're a tourist, you might start riding around as a tourist, the historic locations, the government buildings, the hospitals, whatever. Pinpoint those and then see which ones need to be connected, and that begins to help you understand where your bicycling system might want to go. And this is just sort of a real quick example of something like that. Talking about the neighborhoods, there was the discussion in the Roma area that the streets become the life of the community. Everything happens there. You might begin to recognize that in the design and begin to put in places that begin to say cars are not the dominant thing here. A car can get through here, but this is obviously not designed for a car, and it makes it a much more livable location. This is an example, I believe, someplace from Holland or Northern Europe, but these are beginning to be used all over the place. The design would be more appropriate to the neighborhood, to this area, but the concept is making this a much more usable street for everybody rather than just the cars. And a simple thing, right now, Eurovelo is a system, a bicycling system that covers the entire European Union, and it heads from sort of above the Arctic Circle all the way down to Edirne and beyond. The little map shows the little local areas and the routes, and there's a special day when people go out and do this. Using this more as a way of promoting bicycling and other events that show the advantages of getting around the city by bicycle rather than by vehicle. Helps you reduce some of the congestion issues you're having, reduces some of the pollution issues, and also helps with people's health because they're actually actively using transportation rather than sitting in a vehicle. So there's many advantages to promoting bicycling. One overarching recommendation that we have then through all of this is to look at a master transportation plan that focuses on Edirne city, but then also on Edirne Center, the larger area. How does the transportation system work together? How does that bicycle plan that we talked about, the transit plan that we talked about, the walking plan that we talked about fit together? How do these things fit into your plans for the roadway and the bridge expansion and the light rail? And it looks at the entire transportation system as a package and helps them work together so that you can figure out where do we need to put our resources now? How can we balance our resources to improve all the way through the system rather than just in one area? And it begins to help you get more towards that integrated, balanced transportation system that is the hallmark of a lot of the successful cities around the world. We then looked very, very quickly at an example, and we were looking around the mosque. Most people look at this area because of its heritage assets. We said, well, let's look at it for transportation. What are the issues in transportation in the area? How can we talk about our recommendations in this area in particular? Very simply, putting a few things in, those living streets, tying them into the neighborhoods so that they become more neighborhood areas for transportation and not for roads, primarily based on roads. Introducing, say, a cycle hire system where you have bicycle taxis, can get around the historic core area. Maybe closing off one or two of the roads to total vehicular traffic, but leaving it open for emergency vehicles, for the bus routes and things like that so they can get through, but normal traffic is closed off in those areas. And that a few years ago there was competitions for this whole area. A lot of the entries talked about closing off streets, so there's lots of different ideas and concepts that you consider. Excuse me, just a second. We've already talked about in some of the other presentations the issues of putting in street trees and how they might help. That begins to help with the greenways. It helps to slow traffic. As Greg was talking about, we talked about adding in our list there more crosswalks in some areas to help pedestrians cross the roads. In particular, looking at Paşa Asfalti, I hope that's right. For some of those, that's one of the high crash zones that we noticed. The issue there is that no one is allowed to cross the road except in very specific locations. Therefore, you're getting lots of people crossing irregularly and running through traffic, and that's why we're getting lots of pedestrian and vehicular traffic. Acknowledge that and begin to try to put in some crossings, and we can show you an example of that in a second. Looking at some of the other areas, say for the green infrastructure, they were suggesting that this might be a really good place for an overall comprehensive green infrastructure demonstration site. It's well visited, a lot of people know it. It could serve as a good example. It could have greenway connections out to the forests, out to other areas using those street trees as a way of creating a greenway along some of those entry roads. There could be rainwater harvesting, basically collecting the rainwater, feeding it into the roadways to water the street trees that you're planting. Looking at zero rainwater runoff, trying to collect all the rainwater runoff and using it in specific areas for irrigation. For the heritage assets, they talked about, we've heard about some of the historic fountains already, highlighting those things, bringing those out in the area, in this area so that people can begin to see that system. Looking at your street paving so that it provides accessibility for users, but also ties back into the heritage assets. Looking at a comprehensive interpretive system, or focusing some of the attention on the mosque, or looking at a lot of the recommendations that Greg's team already had for this area. How can they begin to be incorporated here along with some of the other system recommendations? Here's a really, really fast example of cutting in some of the crosswalks. You can tell where people want to cross already because there's big gaps in the middle. And then at the same time, where the center median is wide enough, and if there's not a lot of utilities underneath there, beginning to add street trees along there to frame views, create better pedestrian environments overall. So basically, transportation systems are always evolving. You're never going to get to the perfect system. You always have to keep evolving. You will have more things happening. As Patricia talked about, that cyclical situation, that's what transportation improvements are. They're very similar to that. So you keep thinking of how you can make things better, how this can help your economy, how this can help the community, and have continual improvements. You might be able to start by undertaking some of the simple ideas that we've listed here, and we have a few of them listed here. Using the Hull financial tools to help you begin to do some of these things. There's a lot of tools available in that Hull kit to help you. How can we begin to make this work? One thought might be to create, you've had this workshop here, create an annual student workshop that brings international students from around, say, Europe or around the world into this area to focus on some of these issues. They may be here to focus on a week on, okay, if we're going to do a pedestrian master plan, what would be the key elements we want to start with? Or something as simple as finding ways to add racks to the front of your buses where people can ride to a bus stop on their bicycle, put their bicycle on the front of the bus, when they get off, they take their bicycle off and continue their trip. And that is being used in a lot of other places. It's a well-understood technology, and a lot of people manufacture these things. Find, again, with the whole financial tools, can we find a grant that will help us buy these things, begin to promote bicycling in that way? And it's a pretty easy thing to start with. And then one of the other areas, as we're almost done, we kept thinking of more and more things overall, and we started thinking, you know, we never even thought about boat travel or air travel, and it would make sense to start thinking about an airport in this area as well, as an expansion of your transportation system. So we still think there's lots more things that you can think about, but this will give you a start. You'll have access to this. I didn't outline all of those recommendations or all of the issues, so you can take time in the future to look at them. But we'd be happy at this point to take any other questions or move on, depending on what the audience would like.
Let's move on, then we'll have questions.
Fine.
From everybody at the end.
So we will turn things over to Eric and his team.
Good night. I am Eric Tamulanis, a landscape architect and a principal with a consulting firm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my subject is green infrastructure in Edirne. And you see on the image here our large and enthusiastic team, so we're going to have a slightly different format for our presentation, which will involve some of our Turkish-speaking professionals who will present other parts of this discussion. Our team members were divided into 4 topic areas, and this included water in its natural state in the contemporary circumstances, water in its heritage or historic circumstances, ecology and vegetation as an environmental concept, and then the parks and open spaces that are used by the people and visitors to Edirne. During the course of this, we consulted with a number of city officials who generously gave their time to work with us to describe some of the systems at a level that at least gave us a general understanding of the complexity of the city systems that exist. And this helped us to focus some of our recommendations. So I'll begin here by discussing the definition of green infrastructure. We have used this term a number of times during the course of the week, but I just want to reinforce this, that our concept of green infrastructure is to connect the civic systems that convey water with the natural environment and make that into a unified system of water management and biological diversity. So our definition here is systems that connect the natural and built environments and provide multiple benefits to people and ecosystems across multiple scales. It's a very broad and connecting topic, and one that's fitting for the end of this discussion because it really brings so many of the other features together. The characteristics of this are that this is multifunctional. If we think about this in this concept, as others have described in their presentations, we see an integration and a linkage of these features. It connects habitat just as transportation connects people. It creates a livable city, a habitable city, and improves the quality of life for those who are there. And it aids in the resiliency to some of the concerns that may occur, whether that be flooding or drought, lack of water, or urban heat island effect as a result of climate change. It is significantly important that this is also, especially for Edirne, part of your identity. Water is essential to your foundation and to your future. At last, a wise use of your green infrastructure and development of that will indeed provide a return on investment through savings in irrigation or energy, or simply the quality of life and contribution to biodiversity in the area. So we define this as anything that transmits